Ticket for One by Roel Jimenez. When you find yourself alone in a foreign country, what's the first thing you notice? For me, it wasn't the architecture or the food or the unfamiliar language. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not an absence of sound necessarily. There are always sirens, always conversations you can't quite catch, always the rumble of the tube underneath the streets. Cities themselves are never truly quiet. But this was a different kind of silence. A social silence. It's the empty seat beside you on the train, the pause after you see something interesting and instinctively turn to comment on it, only to remember there's no one there. It's the space where a friend, a roommate, someone who knows you is supposed to be. I spent a semester in London, a city of 9 million stories, and for large stretches of it, I was the sole author of my own. The city moved around me in enormous, complicated ways, but my version of it was often quiet and strangely self-contained. This is the story of that time alone. Part 1. The Theory of Proximity. Most of the time that I spent by myself, even before coming to London, I wondered why that was the case. Why, after 3 years of college, I was still spending so much of it alone. College is supposed to be the easiest place in the world to make friends. There are people everywhere, events every night, clubs for every possible interest. Yet somehow, a lot of my time still unfolded quietly. Before I left for London, I had a very simple theory on friendship. Friends are the people you have a reason to keep talking to. In college, that reason is built into the walls. You live together, attend the same classes, show up to the same clubs and meetings. There are constant excuses to interact. Clubs were especially easy. Everyone already had a shared interest, otherwise they wouldn't be there. You walk into the room and instantly know you have something to talk about. Friendship in that environment feels automatic because you know that the person there is choosing to do that thing over literally anything else with their time. I worried that going into London meant leaving that system behind. My theory suggested that the longer you go without sharing experiences with someone, a tour, a party, a late-night argument about where to get food, the more distant they become. Those experiences act as reaffirmations. See, we're friends. This is what we do. It's why you don't usually invite a complete stranger to a concert. The experience itself confirms the relationship. So, in the weeks before leaving, I felt a low-grade panic. I started trying to manufacture those reaffirmations with my roommates and fraternity brothers. I suggested going out even when I didn't really want to. I pushed for small hangouts, dinners, late-night food runs. Looking back, I realized I was trying to collect memories in advance, like stocking a shelf. Proof that friendships would still exist even if I disappeared for a few months. In a strange way, I was packing for that loneliness. Part 2. The Flat in Zone 2. When I arrived in London, the loneliness wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. It didn't arrive with some cinematic moment where the city suddenly feels enormous and hostile. Instead, it showed up quietly in the rhythm of everyday life. My roommates were good guys, but strangers. Most days, they left early and returned late. The roommate I shared a room with specifically was someone I mainly saw at the beginning and end of the day. Our conversations rarely went beyond groceries or asking if the room was free for a Zoom call. Even the people I halfway knew from when I was on campus already had their own friend groups, their own schedules, and their own lives moving alongside mine. Many mornings, I lay awake in bed, listening to the apartment slowly go quiet. Doors closing, footsteps in the hallway, click at the front door. Eventually, I would get up, check the other rooms, confirm I was alone, and then sit down at my desk to work. Outside was London. Huge, ancient, full of life. Inside was me, doing laundry, cooking pasta, answering emails, alone. Before I left, my parents had worried about exactly this. They feared I'd spend the entire semester inside my room and waste an opportunity they never had at my age. They weren't entirely wrong. That's why I took so many pictures during the first weeks. I sent them constantly. Look, Mom, look, Dad, here's Big Ben, here's the street outside the flat. Here's a random building that looks vaguely historic. It wasn't just sharing the trip, it was evidence. Proof that I was participating in my own life. Part 3. The Tower of London. But the first actual trip I took alone was to the Tower of London. The university had given us free tickets, and I set aside a weekend to use mine. I mentioned the possibility of going to the trip together with my flatmates and a few people I knew from my program. No one could come, and for a moment I was annoyed. This could have been yet another chance to refill my hanging out quota, but the tower was still there, waiting, and every day that went by without me taking that trip was another wasted opportunity. So I went alone. Please. And when I finally stepped inside and looked at the map of exhibits, something clicked. I didn't have to negotiate with anyone about where to go. The Tower of London isn't just one thing. It's 1,000 years of history layered on top of itself. One section covers the kings who ruled there, another describes its role during the World Wars. There's a building for the crown jewels and another explaining the royal menagerie that once lived inside the walls. With other people, visits like this become negotiations. You skip some exhibits, linger at others, someone gets tired, someone wants lunch. You try to keep the group moving. Alone, I could just make a plan. I walked the walls first, then moved inward, methodically exploring everything. I spent 20 minutes staring at a suit of armor simply because I felt like it. I read plaques most people probably would have skipped. I ate lunch on a bench in the sun without asking anyone if the spot was okay. It felt less like a tour and more like a conversation between me and the building. And the silence, I feared, had turned into something useful. Attention. And when the sinking feeling returned, the urge to go home, I could simply leave. Please. Part 4. Stonehenge and Bath. My next big trip was to Stonehenge and Bath. I signed up through a tour group mostly because another guy in my program mentioned he had seen Stonehenge and I thought it was some other opportunity to see something worthwhile. When I arrived at the bus, though, I realized I was the only student from my school. Everyone else was from a university called St. Mary's that was also studying abroad. Most of the people there already knew each other. They laughed in that easy way people do when they share dorms and inside jokes. And I imagined how I'd feel if a stranger suddenly inserted himself into my friend group back home. So I stayed quiet. Before we even reached the highway, I had my reasoning ready. I would never see these people again, so why bother trying? Stonehenge, if I'm honest, was a little disappointing. The stones were a lot smaller than I expected, standing quietly in a roped-off field. I walked the loop around them and took several photos. I tried a few awkward selfies, stretching my arm out to frame both my face and the monument. Asking someone for help felt strangely difficult, like it required crossing a social boundary I wasn't ready for. After about 20 minutes, I returned to the bus and ate the snacks I'd packed. It was efficient. It was also deeply boring. Bath, however, was different. I spent 5 minutes just searching for somewhere to eat before finding a small Thai restaurant called Rose's. Normally, when I eat Thai food, it's with a group. You order several dishes, a basil chicken, pineapple rice, pad thai, and share everything. But alone, I had to choose one meal. I settled for chicken with rice, a bowl of broth, and a Thai iced tea. And I ate every single bite. Chicken, the broth, even the cucumber slice and sprig of cilantro. It wasn't the best meal I'd ever had, but it held my full attention. No conversation, no negotiation, no splitting the bill, just me and the food. When I left, I was full and quietly happy. That seemed like enough. Part 5. Madrid, Spain. A few weeks later, I was actually going to leave London. I went to Madrid through a program and ended up with 3 other people in my dorm. They were already friends with each other. The hotel room was meant for 4 people. I was simply the 4th. There were moments of social interaction during walking tours, but once the tours ended, everyone eventually drifted apart. And that's when I had my first real experience wandering in a foreign city alone. Now far away from all that I had packed in my much bigger suitcase and carrying only a little bit. At one point, I passed a restaurant clearly designed for American students. The menu was glossy and expensive, and my sandwich was $15. And instead of paying even more for chips, I walked to a convenience store and bought chips and a soda for a fraction of the price. It felt strangely satisfying. Even in a completely new place, my brain defaulted to practicality. I cooked meals in my apartment to save money. I packed snacks for tours so I wouldn't have to pay at the locations. I searched for cheaper alternatives whenever I could. Sometimes that meant I wasn't experiencing the city as fully as I could have, but sitting on a park bench, eating those chips and tossing crumbs to pigeons, I felt oddly peaceful. Even abroad, surrounded by unfamiliar buildings and languages, I was still myself. That consistency was comforting. And I didn't have anyone around to tell me I needed to live a little. Part 6. Paris, France. Paris was the first place where I fully embraced being alone. Instead of planning every step, I decided to let chance guide the day. At every major intersection, I flipped a coin. Heads meant right, tails meant left. It sounds ridiculous, but the effect was liberating. Once I had broken off from our tour group after the first bits of the tour were already done, the city revealed itself in fragments: hidden bakeries, quiet streets, sudden bursts of traffic and crowds. I wasn't exactly optimizing anymore, I was just letting the city happen. Because, technically, everything I experienced was a new thing. And there were advantages to traveling alone too. At one restaurant, a line stretched down the block. When the host realized I was by myself, he seated me immediately at a tiny corner table no other group could use. And for the first time, being a party of one felt like an advantage. And that small moment gave me some confidence. If I could navigate Paris alone, albeit still with the tour group, maybe I could plan something bigger by myself. Part 7. Amsterdam. Before I came to London, my dad told me flights could be cheaper if I bought one-way tickets. So I decided I would plan a chain of trips. One flight from London to Amsterdam, one from Amsterdam to Dublin, and lastly, one from Dublin back to London. For the first time, I had to organize everything myself: budgets, flights, maps, and itineraries. I was still nervous when I arrived in Amsterdam. It was the first time staying in a hostel completely alone. The room was full of travelers in their 30s and 40s, people who had clearly been wandering the world longer than I have. The room smelled like feet, the bathrooms were covered in graffiti, and the owners seemed eager to charge for everything from towels to extra toast. One morning, a guest began arguing loudly with the manager about a booking problem, and I quietly finished breakfast and moved to another room. It reminded me how vulnerable solo travel could be. After that, I locked my belongings obsessively, cramming my oversized backpack into a tiny locker. But the freedom balanced it out. Most days, I only scheduled one small activity, and the rest of the time, I got right back to wandering. One time, I rode a tram all the way to the end of the line just to see where it would go. No schedules, no expectations, just curiosity. Part 8. Dublin, Ireland. Ireland was where that solitude finally stopped feeling like something I had to manage and started feeling like something I could enjoy. One afternoon, I took a train outside Dublin because I'd heard about a sandwich shop that had supposedly made a great corned beef. The only real reason I went was curiosity, and the fact that it was cheaper than the tourist spots. Later that day, I took a short walk along to a mountain path. It was quiet in a way cities rarely are. No traffic, no crowds, just wind moving through the grass. I had signed up for this tour with a group, a bunch of strangers and other people who were also Americans, but who I decided not to talk to because I knew that I wanted to appreciate the trip in and of itself. So I took the path that looked like the one the less people were taking. And eventually, we all became separated, and it seemed like the mountain was just for us. The path kept narrowing the more I walked until it felt less like a trail and more like a suggestion. Just a faint line cutting through the grass and keeping me from getting lost in this whole situation turning into a horror movie. In the cities I had been to before, even in Ireland, being alone was always kind of just a choice. There were people everywhere, conversations I could have stepped into, questions I could have asked, small talk I could have made, moments I could have shared if I wanted to. The isolation there was still largely self-imposed, and something I could turn on or off depending on if I really wanted to cross that line. But on the mountain, that option disappeared. I'd reached a point where there was no one to pass, no voices in the distance, no background noise to remind me that the world was still close by. Even the monastery ahead looked less like a destination and more like something suspended outside of time. The closer I got to it, the more I felt like I had stepped out of everything familiar, not just physically, but socially. If I'd wanted to speak to someone, I couldn't. And if I wanted to blend into a crowd, there wasn't one. That was the first time the solitude felt absolute. It was strange at first, almost unsettling. Without the possibility of interaction, there was nothing to measure myself against. No reactions to read, no conversations to fill the space, no subtle reassurance that I existed in relation to other people. The only thing left was my own thoughts, uninterrupted and unconfirmed by anyone else. I think I noticed everything more because of it. The way the wind changed direction in uneven bursts, the sudden bouts of drizzling rain that made me feel justified in taking my umbrella, the rhythm of my footsteps becoming the only consistent sound. Even my thoughts felt louder and more defined, like they had nowhere else to go. And there was no distraction to soften them and no external noise to compete with them. And yet, instead of feeling lonely, it started to feel clarifying. In the city, solitude had always been tangled up in the idea that I was opting out, that I was choosing not to engage, not to reach out, not to participate, but here there was nothing to opt out of. The silence wasn't something I created. It was something inherent to the place itself, and because of that, it didn't feel like a lack. By the time I reached the monastery, I realized that this was the most honest version of being alone I had experienced on the entire trip. Not shaped by avoidance or hesitation, not softened by the presence of others who were just out of reach, but completely unavoidable and strangely peaceful. It made sense why there were some people who chose to fully embrace it. That being said, I still had to go back to the bus. By the end of the semester, my original theory of proximity had quietly fallen apart. Back in college, friendships were reinforced by circumstance. You saw the same people every day. There were built-in reasons to interact, and in London, those excuses disappeared. At first, the silence felt like failure, but eventually, I noticed how it shaped the trip. The Tower of London worked because I was alone. Stonehenge felt lonelier even in a crowd of people. Bath gave me a great meal that I was able to enjoy because I was by myself. And Madrid reminded me that I was still the person that I am, even without others. Paris let me use that personality to guide me across a random trip. Amsterdam showed me the discomfort and the freedom of solitude. And Ireland showed me what that solitude could become. Walking along that mountain path, I realized the silence I feared was giving me something valuable. Space. Space to wander, space to linger, space to decide for myself where to go next. The semester wasn't really about learning how to travel alone. It was about learning that solitude isn't a single experience. Sometimes it's the quiet of an empty apartment, sometimes it's standing alone in a crowd, sometimes it's a perfect meal at a tiny table. Sometimes it's a long walk where no one expects anything from you. Silence never disappeared, but eventually it stopped feeling like something missing and started feeling like an opportunity. If I had to review traveling alone the way I reviewed the Tower of London or that meal at Rosa's, I'd give it a complicated but genuine assessment. It can be boring, it can be uncomfortable. Sometimes it makes you feel like a ghost in your own story. But sometimes when the coin lands heads and you turn down a street you would have never chosen if other people were there with you, it reminds you that being alone doesn't mean you aren't living the story. It just means you're the only one writing it. And the best part of that is fully getting to decide how.